Hello, I'm Dr. Runyan. I'm a professor of the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Cincinnati. I'm also a faculty affiliate and a former head of the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Cincinnati. And I am part of the Decolonizing the Nuclear Studies Curriculum project, for which I am leading the effort on the focus on environmental issues. Well, I do hold a doctorate in international relations, but I am one of the founders of and recognized eminent scholars in the field of feminist international relations. I was a child in the duck and cover era of the Cuban Missile Crisis. By my teens, in the late 60s, I was part of the anti-Vietnam War protests and also the rising feminist and environmental movements. And by my 20s, when I was living in Washington, D.C., I attended various anti-nuclear protests, both against nuclear power and weapons. And then upon entering an international relations doctoral program at the American University there, I focused on international women's peace movements to reimagine security. Many of those at the time were anti-nuclear movements, and indeed my field research during that period brought me to various women's peace camps, protests, and conferences in North America and Europe, as well as to various conflict zones of hotter wars in parts of the global South. And I also was able to attend the Nairobi conference at the end of the UN Decade for Women to be a part of the peace tent and other peace events there. My scholarship since my doctorate is in both feminist peace and security studies and feminist international political economy, including much of that including critiques of militarization generally. But since the 2010s, I returned to a focus on nuclearism, initially prompted by the plan and resistance to it to bury Canada's nuclear waste near the largest operational nuclear power plant in the world. That is near my second home in Canada and is also on Indigenous territory. So this brought me to a focus on Indigenous women's resistances to the nuclear fuel chain, from uranium mining to nuclear weapons and power production, nuclear testing, and of course, the resulting nuclear waste. Again, during the early stages of my time in the professorate, I did, obviously it was during the Cold War, so I taught critical perspectives on world politics that included critiques of deterrence and mutually assured destruction, and basically showing the weaknesses of that kind of mentality. And then as I moved forward, a lot of the focus of my teaching was more on militarization more generally after the so-called end of the Cold War, and obviously looked at a variety of ways to critique hot wars, and the ways in which, from feminist perspectives, in terms of how to resist, sort of hegemonies in the world order that made for that kind of violence, and to connect international violence with domestic violence. And then more recently, I was able to bring a return to focus on nuclearism in my teaching, particularly in a course on critical perspectives on war, peace, and security, and developed a module for that course, which is more at the graduate level, in which we looked at critical perspectives on more generally on nuclear politics, included works like Jean-Claude Bissois's Nuclear Desire, and other works by the so-called FemNukes collective, things that people have been producing to revisit questions of nuclear politics, and particularly through feminist perspectives. Of course, I have known Carol Cohn much of my professional life, and I have used her article consistently in all my courses on sex and death in the rational world of defense intellectuals. Well, given my focus on the nuclear fuel chain these days, I think the point I want to get across is the slow and forever violence that the nuclear fuel chain constitutes is in fact widespread around the world, not only as a legacy of the rise of the atomic era and the Cold War, but also from the continued development and now re-expansion of nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Past and present irradiated places are in many backyards, from indigenous territories to rural and urban communities. Certainly, we're still seeing the resulting contamination from the Manhattan Project that was across the United States. But there's denial by governments and industries about the health, environmental, and sociocultural impacts of this. So while environmental racism, classism, and sexism, along with nuclear colonialism, mean that indigenous peoples and peoples of color, and particularly women within these categories, bear special brunts, nuclear contamination knows no boundaries or temporalities, putting wide swaths of people long and perhaps forever at risk, in addition to the threat of nuclear war. Well, I would have to say first that there are current assaults on higher education by the US on the transnational right that seek to censor teaching and scholarship on not only gender, race, sexuality, but also critical approaches to foreign policy and international affairs that challenge the unjust world order, including the nuclear order. And this is certainly happening already in my state. There are also trends towards remilitarization and expansion of the nuclear order, once again reigniting threats of nuclear war, particularly in the wake of the Russian war in Ukraine, which has also re-raised the specter of nuclear power meltdown. And as we know, the Chernobyl space has been disturbed by this war, as that is further contaminating even the soldiers in it. At the same time, nuclear power, which is differently dirty from fossil fuels, is being resurrected as an option to deal with climate change rather than a switch to renewables, producing ever more uranium mining and nuclear waste for which there is no safe or just solution, most often further despoiling indigenous lands and waters. But I have to say that I do take some heart in the ongoing resistances of indigenous peoples against both settler and nuclear colonialism to assert their now international indigenous rights, to withhold consent for nuclear colonialism to continue to take place on their lands. So this is constituting a way to break the nuclear fuel chain on which nuclear production, deployment, and disposal depends to continue.